This is Warren Vanderhill with the Muncie Jewish Oral History Project, talking with Anne Kallmeyer Secctor, Mrs. Julian Secctor, at her home in Marion, Indiana, Friday, April 27, 1979. Anne, I'd like to begin by asking you if you would tell me a little bit about your parents, where they were before they came to Muncie, how they happened to be where they were, how they met, and then we can sort of go on from there.
My mother was born in Wabash, Indiana, and my father came from Detroit, Michigan. They met in Muncie through mutual relatives and knew each other 3 weeks and then were married in Wabash.
What was your father doing in Detroit? How did he happen to go to Detroit?
How did he happen to go? He was born in Detroit.
He was born
and raised in Detroit.
Okay.
My father was I guess a gay blade. He gambled and was a traveling salesman. Came to Muncie and set up business with his brother, who was Herman Marks, and Uncle Herman and my father went into business together in a clothing store. Uncle Herman had come to Muncie to be with the Ringolds, and because his wife's sister was married to Sam Ringgold, and Sam Ringgold had a clothing store, and then they started business. They went into business together. Then Uncle Herman and my father opened a store and went into business together. It was Marks and Kallmeyer for a while, and then my father and my uncle split, and my father had a store, and then Uncle Herman had a store. My father had a men's clothing store. I can't remember the years that he was in business because I was just a small child then, and then he lost the business and became a traveling salesman for the Redfern Coat Company out of Toledo, Ohio, and traveled with them for, I think, about 10 years, 10, 12 years. He lost his job in, you want to go back to my mother?
Oh, yeah.
You want to keep it in chronological order?
Fine, just talk about your father, and we'll go back and talk about your mother, and bring them.
My father lost the business and then became a salesman for the Redfern Coat Company and worked for them until 1933, at which time he lost the job. It was during the Depression. And they took him off the road, and he was out of work for about a year before he became a liquor salesman. That's when Prohibition was over, and became a liquor salesman, then for Kiefer Stewart out of Indianapolis. And he was a wholesale liquor salesman until 1936 when he died.
How much education did he have? Formal education?
Did my father
Yes.
have? High school. Mm-hmm. My mother had high school education. Neither one were college.
Okay. Well, tell me a bit then to switch to your mother's family. She was born in Wabash, Indiana, which you commented during our conversation before we began taping. At that time, had a fairly large Jewish community.
Yes. She was born and raised in Wabash, and lived there until she was married.
Now, how did she happen to meet your father?
Well, as I said, she came to Muncie to visit mutual relatives, and they met there. And my father proposed to her, and she went home and told her mother she was going to get married, and she got married.
A whirlwind courtship.
Yes, a whirlwind courtship. In fact, she used to tell the story that my uncles had never met my father, and one of my uncles was in the Army, and came in just before the service started, and sat down and asked which one was the groom, because there were two men standing up there. He didn't know which one it was. And my mother came from a large family. She had 7 brothers, and she was the only girl.
Well, after your father died, what did your mother do? She stayed in Muncie?
She stayed in Muncie. We had no monies. My father left very little insurance. And my brother and I was 16 years old. My brother was 14 years old. And we finished high school in Muncie. Mother went to work. She went to work for Bernard's father, Will Friend. And she sold the house on University and went into an apartment. Well, she didn't sell the house right away when my father died. She kept the house until after we were graduated from high school. We both finished high school in Muncie. And I went to business college in Indianapolis for 6 months and then came back and finished up in Muncie. I went to work at the gas company, and in 1940 I got married and left. My brother lived in Muncie. He graduated high school, and then when the war broke out, he enlisted in the Navy, and he left Muncie.
When were you born? I always hesitate to ask women that. But
When was I born?
yeah.
January 21st, 1920. I'm not ashamed of my age. I'm very proud. I'm glad I made it. I'm 59 years old, and I'm very happy to be here.
I'd like to have you reflect a little bit on what the Jewish community was like when you were a young girl up through high school, let's say.
Up through high school?
Yeah. How did you see this community, this small Jewish community in an overwhelmingly Protestant town? What things stand out as far as the Jewishness of the community?
I didn't sense any particular type of Jewishness. I knew I was Jewish because I went to Sunday school at a different time than other children went to Sunday school. I knew I went to a different type of church than other children went to because of the temple. The temple was as it is today. I don't think it's changed from the time I was born. I know that my father and people of his generation built that temple. As a youngster, as a baby, that temple was not there. They used to meet up in club rooms, and they raised money, and that small community built that temple. I can't tell you how many families. I think it's recorded in Muncie, but I can't tell you how many families. But my father was one of those people who raised money and built that temple. And Uncle Herman, Schwartz's, but we were always associated with Jewish families. In addition to, but I never felt any definite Jewishness. There were no other Jewish students in my classes in high school or all through school. They were either older or younger than I, but no one my particular age. Herb Pazel was older than I was. Marty Schwartz was older than I was. Bernard. My cousin Peggy Marks was older than I was. But we associated in activities in the temple, many activities, suppers, services on Friday night, high holiday services. We always knew we were Jewish, but I never felt as an outsider in anything. I knew there was a difference because I knew that Jewish people couldn't belong to the country club. It was only the one country club, the Delaware Country Club at that time. And but I never felt as a social outcast. And you must remember that up until I was around 12 years old, it was an affluent community. A lot of good times, a lot of parties. I can remember my parents, my father loved to drink, and they used to have big parties there, formal parties, with the crystal and the silver and the whole bit. And of course, in those days, you used to have people help in your homes. It wasn't that everybody pitched in and helped. I never did too much. I had to take care of my room, but that was it. I never knew how to cook until I got married and that sort of thing. So I didn't know. When my father passed away, I shouldn't really put it that way. Up until the time that my father lost his job, we were very well off. From then on, it was not a hardship. They never let us know that it was a hardship. Mm-hmm. Then when my father passed away, my mother had to go to work, and I can remember my mother baking goods, and my brother and I used to go out and peddle because there wasn't enough money. Mm-hmm. I paid for my schooling. My grandmother paid for my schooling, business college. My brother never got to go away to school. He worked from the time my father died.
Were most of your parents' friends also members of the Jewish community?
Yes. Most all of them.
So as far as your parents' social life, it was pretty much contained
Jewish,
or confined?
Confined to the Jewish community.
To the Jewish community. All right, what about your social life when you were growing up in Muncie? Did you have as many non-Jewish friends, more Jewish friends than...
I had more non-Jewish friends than I had Jewish friends. Because I was president of a social club in Muncie. There were many social clubs in high school when I was in high school. Sewing club, TNC, Violet club. I was president of the TNC club for 2 years in Muncie. That was the lowest on the scale. It used to be sewing, Violet, and TNCs economically. The more affluent were in the sewing club. The next were in the Violet club, and then. But the social scene in Muncie was just marvelous. I say today, kids don't have the good times that we had then. During the Christmas holidays, we had a dance every single night. Every single night in Muncie.
Were there any Jews in the sewing club?
Yes, Peggy Marks, my cousin, was. I think she was the only one at that time. It was quite a thing that Peggy got into the sewing club.
Yeah, the clubs have kind of declined now. Right?
Have they?
Yeah, the sewing club is hardly an establishment club in Muncie anymore. But I had heard.
Is it still there?
It's still there, and occasionally they crop up in the with a picture or two or a mention in the social columns of the Star or the Press. But the individuals who were involved no longer have familiar names, let us say, as far as Muncie's social elite would be concerned.
Now, I don't want you to get me wrong. I had many friends in all the clubs. And we interchanged on these dance deals. I mean, we bought tickets to their dances, they would buy tickets, and they were formal dances. And we used to have big orchestras. I can remember going to the dances, and we'd have the dance on a Saturday night. If TNC's had a dance, we didn't know where the money was going to come from. And at those days, the tickets used to be $2 and $2.50 to get into the dance per couple. And those bands used to charge us $500. And we didn't know, literally, at 7 o'clock at night, where we were going to get those kind of monies. But by gosh, everybody came through, and there they were, and all these new formals. Every night you'd see a different formal. The girls would... It was fantastic and fun. And we'd go to work. I used to work at ball stores in Muncie, get in the gift wrapping department. And you go to work at 9 o'clock in the morning, work till 9 o'clock at night, go home, change clothes, go to the dance. Next day you're back at work. And I mean dances every single night. Monday through Friday during those. And we used to have 2 weeks of vacation. It was the TMCs. There were 3 or 4 boys clubs, and then there were three girls clubs. And they used to have those dances every night. Perry Como came to one of our... In fact, we had Ted Weems in his orchestra for our junior-senior prom. And Perry Como walked in the Coliseum there and helped us decorate.
Classy stuff.
You're not kidding. Of course, he wasn't known like he was today.
You mentioned that you had met your husband at a gathering, conclave, I think is the word that you used, of Jewish young people from Anderson, Marion, and Muncie.
Well, I had met Julian before. I didn't really remember him. But Marion's social life was much different. The Jewish social life was much different than ours. They had a bigger Jewish group than we had in Muncie. And they used to have dances on New Year's Eve. The Jewish community used to have dances as a whole. And I came to Muncie, or to Marion, with a date from Fort Wayne. He drove down to pick me up in Muncie, and I came up here. And that's when I met Julian. But Marion always had a New Year's Eve dance as a full community. Yeah. And then other people from other communities. And Muncie and Anderson and Marion used to get together for social events of that kind. And that's how Julian and I met. This wasn't at a conclave, but I had met Julian before. But before I met Julian and after we met, we had a Jewish youth group in the state of Indiana. And then when the war broke out, the last officers of that were all girls. And then it just disintegrated after that. But we used to go all over the state for our meetings.
How important were Jewish values in your home when you grew up?
To me or to my folks? You mean as an overall picture of our rearing?
Yeah, of your home within the Muncie Jewish community.
We always observed the Sabbath. My father gave all the blessings. My mother would... we always had candles every Friday night. And traditional family meals. We'd go to temple on Friday night. But on the other hand, we had Christmas trees. My mother always felt that as a child she'd never had a Christmas tree, and she always felt she was missing something, so she always felt she had to give it to us. But so I really didn't have this sense of Jewishness in that respect, except that I knew that Friday night that we lit candles. I was confirmed. I went to temple every week, to Sunday school every week, and I knew that I was different. I was not a Christian, but I was raised in a home where my grandparents were Christian Zionists. My grandmother lived with us for a number of years, and even took my brother and I to Christian Zionist church occasionally with her. So that the values were there. My parents observed them, and I think my father had a deeper sense of the meaning, had more to him than my mother at that time. But it was never predominant. I never felt any different than anybody else.
As you look back, what would you say about the relationship between Jews and non-Jews in Muncie? And you can...
My peers or my parents' peers?
Again, both. I think we're talking about two generations. You've already commented on your relationships with many, many non-Jews.
Yeah. I never felt any different. I remember my father used to make remarks about people not liking Jews, or it's because I'm Jewish or something like that. And I don't even know in what reference at this point. I can't remember what reference, but I do. And I remember my father taking me down to see a Klan. That was outstanding. I can remember seeing a Klan parade in the 1920s.
So you knew what the Klan represented?
Oh, yes. But never as a threat. I mean, to me, I was just, I may have been 8 or 9 years old at the time. I was around 28, 29. But it was never a threat. Never any fear of anything like that. But now my family, my mother and father played a lot of bridge, and they were very social-minded. And they played with non-Jewish couples. I can remember that. But as far as socially acceptable, my mother was active in only in temple affairs, not like I'm involved today in community affairs. Nothing political, nothing volunteering at the hospital or anything like that. And I don't even think they had them in those days, that type of thing that I ever was aware of. But my mother was very active in the temple and was president of the sisterhood and that sort of thing. And my father was active in the temple and the B'nai B'rith. But other than that, their social life was mostly with the Jewish community. But you must remember, they had a larger Jewish community. It was the community wasn't as big in those days, so that the Jewish community was fairly good size.
You mean the entire city?
Yeah, this entire city. And there were a number of us in Sunday school. We were combining classes in Sunday school. Grade levels were combined, so not like the high school or grade school. As I say, I didn't have anybody in my particular classes in those days, but they were always with me in school.
Do you think that the way that you have raised your children, as far as Jewishness is concerned, is different than the way you were raised?
Oh, definitely.
How so?
Well, first place, my husband is much more religious than my father ever was. The religion meant more to him. He wanted to raise his children, particularly in the religious atmosphere. We've never had a Christmas tree. My children, we've always had Hanukkah. When we have Hanukkah, we invited people in, their friends in, to help celebrate. But they would be invited, but we never had celebrated Christmas. My children know the difference and have been raised that way. They went to temple. Now, although their friends are predominantly Gentile, they don't have we are the only family whose children came back to Marion, Indiana, the only Jewish family, besides the mayor, Tony Bainbert. And the rest of them have gone. The children that my children were raised with have all gone. They went through Sunday school. They were confirmed. Both of our boys were bar mitzvahed. My brother was never bar mitzvahed. My father didn't think that was necessary. We were both confirmed. My children are much more aware of their Jewishness than I ever was. We never celebrated Hanukkah in the schools. Today, which I don't always agree with. And I didn't agree with it at the time it was happening. But I felt that, and my husband didn't agree with it at the time, but we were asked to do it by the teachers, and we never said no. And yet they participated, and my children participated in religious singing, not plays. When it came time to do any acting in it, they were never in those. In the Christian plays type thing. All my children have been in drama, and I've worked in drama and been in shows, but never in a Christian, not in the element of the Christmas season and that sort of thing.
You commented a bit ago on your education. I'd like to get that on tape. You graduated from Central?
I graduated from
Central
Muncie
High
Central
School.
in 1938.
Then you went to business college?
I went to Central Business College in Indianapolis in 38 and 39. Oh, well, I actually went for 6 years. I started in August of 38, for 6 months, and went until about February. Then I came back to Muncie and went to school in Muncie, the Central Business College in Muncie. And I went until July and got a job at the gas company and worked there. That was in July of 39, and worked there until September of 1940.
Then you were
when
married.
I got married. Mm-hmm.
Have you worked since you have been married?
No. Okay. I can't type anymore. I can't take shorthand anymore.
One time you could take shorthand,
yeah.
One time you could type.
Right.
But you have been very active in all sorts of activities and organizations here in Marion. Since you've lived in two different Jewish communities in this particular part of Indiana, do you think there are any marked differences between the Marion Jewish community and the Muncie Jewish community?
When we were first married, our association was completely with Jewish families. Our social life revolved completely around the temple.
Here in Marion?
Here in Marion. We were married for 5 years before I had any children, because of going into the service and so forth. That's what drew us to the temple, but the children more than, it drew me more into the temple. Julian was always involved in temple activities. And I became very active in the temple, being president of the sisterhood and so forth. You want to cut that off a minute?
Sure. Well, we're talking about the contrasts and comparisons that you were making between the Marion Jewish community and the Muncie Jewish community. I'm not so sure they were, contrasts. They may be very similar.
They're similar in the respect that my part of participating has been much greater in participating in the Jewish community in Marion than it ever was in Muncie. I mean, just going to school and, up till I was 16 years of age, I didn't really, I knew I was Jewish, but that wasn't the involvement. But here I really got involved. I mean, teaching Sunday school and being president of the sisterhood and being on all the boards of the sisterhood. And as I said, up until about 4 or 5 years ago, that was the involvement of the Jewish community. It was just recently that the Jews were allowed in the country club here. They opened up their membership. And this country club was started by the Jews many years ago in Marion.
The Jews started the club and they all were out?
Then they were out because the Depression came along and they couldn't keep up their dues, so they had to drop it. Then they had, around World War,
So the Christians took over the club.
The Christians took over the club, and it was, we lost a member here, and once he was gone, then the board opened up, and now most of the Jewish community belong to the country club. And our life our social life has changed. The Jewish community is no longer the closely knit community that it was when our children were growing up. It's simply because the children are gone, the parents have become involved in different other social life. And we aren't as the close community that we were once before.
Are there many Jewish families who move into Marion?
No.
Same as Muncie, then, with the exception of the university.
Yes. No, industry is not bringing them in simply because we don't have that much to offer. The first thing they want to know is, what kind of a temple do you have? Who is your rabbi? Our rabbis are students from the Hebrew Union College. They have been students ever since the temple was built. In fact, a temple was built with monies from Muncie, Indiana, from the Ball brothers. Julian's uncle went to Ball brothers in Muncie and got a gift of, I don't know how many thousands of dollars at that time, to start this temple here in Marion.
Great historical fact.
Yes, they put the money into the Ball brothers, helped finance this Marion, and of course with the help of the Marion community, the Jewish community. But this was a small community, the same as Muncie was. They met in club rooms until they built their temple. And now we're back down to, I don't think we've got 30 families in Marion. Then that's counting widows.
Well, let me ask you, I suppose, the summa question, and that is, again, looking at Muncie, a place where you were born and raised, and Marion as well, because you've lived here since 1940. What do you think the future is of Jewish communities of this size?
The future. I don't think there's much of a future for Marion as far as the Jewish community is concerned. My own family. My daughter was married to a Gentile for 11 years and got a divorce last year. My son was married, it'll be 2 years in August, and he married a non-Jew. Jerry's the only one that isn't married, and I don't know whether he will get married or not. He likes his single life. As I said, my children are the only ones that came back to Marion. They know their position in the community as Jews, but yet they have no Jewish friends. There are none of their peers are here, so they are naturally integrated into the Gentile community.
So there's a good deal of Jewish out-migration, no Jewish
in-migration. Industry is not bringing any Jews, as I said, that simply because there's no social life here as far as Jewish social life is concerned. We have Jewish doctors. We have Jewish people at the mental health clinic. As far as industry is concerned, there are no Jews in the industry here. They're either in business or professions, but nothing in it. And it's simply because they don't like the idea of having to commute to Fort Wayne or Indianapolis for what they call a Jewish cultural life. I remember when Julian has had 2 hip operations, and he's gone to Boston each time for them. In fact, he's had 3. He had to have 1 redone. And the first time we went, the orthopedist went with us, Dr. Kirshner. And at that time, he was in practice by himself, and there were some fellows that were in the firm that Julian was going to. And he tried to talk one of the Jewish doctors into coming to Marion, and the doctor's wife didn't want to live in a small community. She wanted to live in the city. Now, that may be changing. That was 8 years ago, so that may be changing. I don't know, but it won't change in Marion, Indiana. They're still having... We have one Jewish general practitioner here that's been looking for an associate, and wants a Jewish associate, and hasn't been able to find one, and Max is close to 70.
Are there any comments, additional ones that you'd like to make about the Muncie community? Because what I'm going to do, since I think it's quite unique, I want to have you talk a little bit about the anti-Semitic situation with the current campaign for mayor here. Because if I don't do that, I'm going to forget it, and I'd like to get it on tape. So I'm going to conclude the Muncie portion.
Okay.
Unless you have some other comments as you now look back on what we've talked about here this morning. Are there any sort of concluding comments that you might like to make?
No, I had a happy childhood. I didn't know of any differences. I didn't have the monies that some of the Jewish families had. My family didn't have that kind of monies in later life. Now, they were equal as far as financial conditions were concerned up until my father lost his business at the clothing store. And then when he became a traveling salesman, things changed. It didn't change as far as their relationship was concerned, but we weren't as affluent in doing things as traveling and so forth as other people were able to do. But that never seemed to bother me because everybody else around me seemed to be in the same boat. I never knew nobody tried to flaunt anything in front of me or show. No, I can't say I've lost touch with Muncie people because, except for with Bernard and Ruth, because my life has been here, and I've had my family to raise, and we just lived separate lives. So I enjoyed my life in Muncie. I can't say that it was a bad scene at all. It was very good.
Okay, I want to thank you for all those comments, and at this point I'd like to switch to what I think for an Indiana city, a somewhat unique situation, namely that for the last, is it a 2-year term or a 4-year
term?
For the last 4 years, Marion, Indiana has had a young, I'm sure you would say dynamic mayor, whose name is Tony Maidenberg. Mm-hmm. He is a second-generation Jewish citizen of Marion, Indiana, and he is the incumbent. He is running for re-election. His opponent's name is Dick Treber,
Right.
Treber, and in this campaign, which is currently being conducted, there have been some major elements of anti-Semitism, given Marion's racial and religious history. I don't think the first side of the tape ended that there have been some anti-Semitic situations in this current mayoral campaign, and I would like to have you comment on those, if you would. You can even admit your bias, that you are certainly a supporter of young Mr. Maidenberg.
Definitely. Tony campaigned 4 years ago. We expected this type of thing to come out. He was a young, at that time he was 28 years old. He was a young Jewish person who came from an extremely wealthy family. And we expected the overtones of anti-Semitism, of the wealth of the young man, with his father owning quite a bit of property in the community and so forth. It didn't come out last time. Now this time, the opponent, Mr. Treber, says that he's working for the little people. Now I don't know what it means by little people. To me that's an insult to a person, but he says he's working for the little people. He doesn't want the affluent. He doesn't need the business people. He has refused to come to Chamber of Commerce meetings with Tony. His talk against Tony's father, owning property that was sold to the city for the purpose of a city hall and so forth. And this, just a few weeks ago, it was learned through the Chronicle Tribune, which is our newspaper, in an investigation of the Chronicle, that Mr. Treber's books of 1976 and 77 were not so kosher. Mr. Treber is the county clerk, and it was found that he didn't make deposits daily as he was supposed to. In fact, there was a period of 2 months when deposits were not made. Well, this stemmed out, and this started the ball rolling, and the politics started to get a little dirty. On the morning of Good Friday, and this is ironic, now whether they picked that morning purposely, of course we'll never know, a cross was burned at the home of one of our Jewish citizens, and it was Jake Weinberg, that was his name. He is a widower. He has been involved in politics for all the time he's been in Marion, and that's a long time. He was a good friend of Mr. Treber's. When this divulged information came out, the blame was put on Jake as having divulged the source of as being the source where the newspaper got their. And that's why we think the cross was burned. We'll never know whether it was a Klansperson who burned it, because we are in a community, in the county of the second largest Klan registration in the state of Indiana. There are many, many sympathizers. They're not necessarily registered Klan members, but they are a lot of sympathizers. The Fisher body is filled with them. Constantly we are getting information out of there that they have all kinds of propaganda stuff on their bulletin boards, right out in the open.
Yeah.
Blacks are most concerned about this. People that are wearing the Treber button, particularly in the Fisher body plant, are not necessarily city people. They are county people, and they are outside of the county, because that plant employs a lot of people, and they don't all live in the city. So they are the sympathizers. Now, as I said, we can't prove. There has been no proof. There has been alarm and indignation on the part of the community. Remarks, well, I'm ashamed to live in a community that even has one person that would do something like that. We have a large Catholic community. They are much concerned about this. And they aren't so terribly aware of those of us who are Jewish, more or less, of the Klan activities. We're much more aware of it. And I'm more aware of it because I have worked on Human Relations Commission and so forth, where I work with the police department. We know that anybody can go down and see that list if they want to, the Klan members. But the affluent in the community, the business people in the community, kind of push it aside. And until something like this comes up, they don't think anything about it. Well, it makes them much more aware. I was angry. I wasn't fearful, but I was angry. Many people were fearful. But, and the youth today, it was, it was an alarm to them because that hasn't been brought out in the last few years.
Did the cross burning receive coverage in the paper?
Oh, yes. A lot of coverage. Pictures involving Jake, showing the burn cross on the ground. It was a 5-foot cross, covered with 5 foot high and I think 4 foot wide, and covered with soaked burlap. And it was a Jewish person who saw the fire. The dog of Dick Simons woke him up, and they tried to rouse Jake and couldn't get him aroused. He slept through the whole thing. He didn't even know it until the next morning, until Tony called and told him. But it's that type of thing. And, of course, as I said, with Frank, if Frank Maidenberg had not owned the property that the mayors wanted for the city hall, and the mayor didn't particularly want it, this was a feasible study that was done by a planning commission committee. It was selected by an overall committee that Tony had appointed, not politically. I mean, all factions of the community had their input as to the selection of this site that was picked up, and it so happened it was Frank Maidenberg who owned the land. Frank sold it for exactly what he paid for it, plus the taxes of the years that he owned it. He did not. In fact, he lost money on it, and we've tried to point that out because had his son not been mayor, and he could have sold it for an industrial park or a business property, he would have made a hell of a lot more money on it. This way, he made nothing.
Is this the first time that this sort of overt anti-Semitism has occurred since you lived in Marion?
No.
I mean, other than the country club that we talked about a bit before.
Other than the country club?
Yeah.
No, because the only time up until a few years ago that we were accepted socially in the community, not particularly for the country club, was that we were always asked. The whole community has served on United Way organizational work. Were very acceptable. Socially, other than that, we were not so terribly associated with. I mean, we were not accepted. And there for a while, when it was finally, what happened was that a few years back, one of the Jewish couples' name was proposed and turned down. And that's been maybe 10 years ago. At that time, then we had been going out to the country club for big affairs, civic affairs, and so forth. We got together as a community and refused to go to anything until they opened it up. And they finally opened it up. And now, as I said, most of us are in it. It's just the fact that we wanted to go. Now we're working on blacks.
Do you think that Mr. Maidenberg will be successful in his campaign?
Oh, definitely. Definitely. Now, of course, I'm biased, but
You're biased,
but yes, there's the over. Oh, yes.
How old is he? You mentioned his youth.
Yes, he is. Tony was just. What's 47? 32 years old. He was 32 years old 2 weeks ago. He was when he was elected the first time, he was the youngest mayor that the city had ever had.
Well, I'll definitely have to keep my eye on this one.
Oh, yeah. It's going to be interesting to see what happens.
So I want to thank you for talking with me. This has been Warren Vanderhill talking with Ann Kallmeyer Secctor at her home in Marion, Indiana on Friday, April 27, 1970.